Hi everyone, so like I was telling you earlier today, this is a short section of our notes from last class, which was 7.12, the beginnings of World War II. This little section is going to be talking about the various specific groups that were in World War II, the specialized divisions and so on and so forth that we just didn't get to. So let's go ahead and get ourselves started. So I'm actually going to ask you guys in just a moment to actually pause the video to watch another video, and that video is a cartoon called Private Snafu. The U.S. Army had an issue at the beginning of the war because although they had brought in a very large army through both the draft as well as volunteers, there were a lot of men who had very poor reading skills and very little education. And so handing them a giant manual of protocols was just not going to work. And so they created this character and these cartoons to help the men learn military protocol through these very fun, silly instructional cartoons. Now, the reason he gets the name, Private Snafu, is from a military acronym that is used, and that stands for Situation Normal, All, and I'll let you figure out the rest of it. And it's basically saying that a snafu is anything that goes wrong, but you expect it to go wrong because things always go wrong. Well, that's exactly what Private Snafu is all about. He always does everything wrong. And so men were able to learn from kind of his negative example. Like, you want to do exactly the opposite of what Private Snafu did. And these were really popular because of just how well made they were. There were some incredibly talented people that were involved in the creation of it. They were directed by Frank Capra, who is the man who directed It's a Wonderful Life. It was written by Theodore Geisel, who you better know as Dr. Seuss, and you'll definitely be able to tell that just based on like the pattern and the rhyming that goes along with it. But it was then voiced by Mel Blanc, who is the man who voiced Bugs Bunny. So it was incredibly relatable and recognizable for the men. It was fun, and it also taught them something. So if you'd like to watch a Private Snafu video, there's one that's linked on our class website just above this video, and that one is titled Spies. And so, ladies and gentlemen, the war does begin, and in Europe, and we are seeing that this is growing in intensity very quickly. And in September of 1940, we passed the Selective Service Act. This is significant because it is the very first peacetime draft in American history. We had never called a draft before for a time period where we weren't actually in war. And we generally only called it in war when we were starting to run out of volunteers. Now we were bringing men in and we weren't actually involved. And that made a lot of people nervous, thinking, well, maybe Roosevelt's trying to push us into a war. It was going to require that all men between the ages of 18 and 45 register for the draft and be brought in for a one-year term. So that was going to be from October 1940 to October of 1941. Excuse me. By the early summer of 1941, FDR asks Congress to extend the term of duty. And a lot of soldiers who were upset about this because they were expecting to get out began to write Ohio on their helmets and on their belongings. Ohio stood for Over the Hill in October, essentially saying, look, I was supposed to get out in October and you're not letting me out. And there was a lot of anger and protest against this. However, when the Japanese did attack at Pearl Harbor, thousands of American men volunteered for service, and many more of them that had been drafted before would actually enlist on their own choice immediately following the attack at Pearl Harbor. So now we're going to be getting into some of the specific groups that helped us in our success in World War II. And the first of these that we're going to be talking about is a man by the name of Juan Pujol Garcia, the man you see pictured here. You'll notice in the picture he looks very different in actually each of these three images. And that is because he was a spy, and actually he was a double agent. He was a double agent for the British, and he was so good at this act that he got the nickname of Agent Garbo, which was kind of a nod to the very like enigmatic actress Greta Garbo here in the U.S. At the beginning, this man, well, first of all, let me go backwards. He's from Spain, which is a country that is not involved in World War II at all. They are neutral. And he wanted to help the British. And the British were like, your country's not involved. You have no experience in this. You have no ties and contacts. So, no, we're not going to take you on as a spy. Like, that's silly. But he really, like, deep in his gut knew that he would be good at this. And so he goes to the Germans and he says, hey, I'd like to help spy for you. And they're like, yeah. Like, you don't have any experience in this. Like, your country's not involved. Like, we're not going to take you on. And he says, yeah, but like, I know all these really important people in Spain. And he starts listing off these names of these aristocrats that he knows in Spain. And they're like, okay, well, maybe that could be useful to us. And then he starts to feed them information. And he's basically just reporting actual movements of different battalions um, that are actually happening. And it's not really secret information, but the fact that he's bringing it to them and the way he's bringing it to them makes it seem like he's got this like inside knowledge. The Germans start to like give him more assignments of like, okay, give us this information, give us this information. So once he's got the confidence of the Germans, he goes back to the British and he goes, hey, so the Germans just made me a spy and I'd like to be a double agent for you. And so they were like, are you serious? And so they go ahead and they make him a double agent. And so he is able to gather information for both the British, so both the Allies, and then fake out the Axis. And like I said, he kind of starts off with these like realistic things and he starts to slowly feed them like this more and more false information to the point where he's straight up giving them like 100% just made up stuff. And the most important one that he sent uh, was when he was trying to convince Hitler to not put forth a large battalion at Normandy. Hitler was looking at potentially, putting a lot of force there because he's like, well, that's going to be the most logical place for them to attack at. And Pujols really does the best that he can to convince them, no, Normandy is not going to be the thing. Like, you're wrong, this is fake. Well, then the Normandy invasion happens. And Hitler's now looking at this guy like, see, you were wrong, and so maybe you're not that good of a spy. So what he ends up doing is he tells Hitler and the high command, oh, no, that wasn't the real invasion. This was just like reserves. What you really need to do is you need to send them, like this is the fake invasion. You need to send your men down the road to Pas de Calais. Pas de Calais is where they're actually having the massive invasion. And so Hitler sends an order and turns his men around and sends them to Pas de Calais. And that is why we were able to march through Normandy and we were able to march into Paris with virtually nothing in our way because the Germans believed this guy and marched their men to Pas de Calais instead. Later on, because of his help in the war and helping the Germans, despite the fact that all the stuff that he told them was fake, he was actually awarded the Iron Cross, which was the Nazis' highest honor. And at the same time, for him serving as a double agent for the British, he was also given essentially their version of the Congressional Medal of Honor. And so he earned the highest awards that you can get from two countries that he was spying for, which I think is fantastic. And because of this man's deception, it allowed us, the Allies, to be able to march in closer to Germany. The other one that's going to be very helpful for this is the Ghost Army. And this was fantastic. This was a group that was put together by the federal government, and they were their secret battalion, and they were called the Ghost Army because they didn't actually exist. That their whole job was to create falsehoods to fake out the Axis. So, for example, a munitions factory that was located here in the United States, we didn't want the Germans to be able to tell what were munitions factories and building bombs and what places weren't. So we would have these guys who were largely artists and sound technicians and actors and costume makers and all kinds of like artistic and theatrical people. We had them paint the rooftops of all of those buildings so that it looked like the countryside. Um, so that if a plane was flying over, they wouldn't be able to tell that this was actually an Allied munitions factory. We also had them create these false, like entirely false battalions. So you can see these men filling up the air in this false tank that you can clearly see is light as air. Um, and what they would do is they would actually have men crawl up underneath it. They would crawl up into this like blank space underneath the tank there, and they would like lift it on their shoulders and like slide it around as if it was a real live tank moving around, so that when there are these spy planes that are flying over these quote unquote battalions, they see stuff moving around and they're like, well, of course, this is definitely, a real live thing in it. So it would fake out the Germans and make them put their emphasis in places where we weren't actually going to go. And this was really helpful because we paired these guys with the information that Juan Pujol Garcia was giving the Germans. And so we set up all of these fake battalions, this fake landing gear and fake tents. We even had like fake radio broadcasts that were being sent out specifically so the Germans could hear, that were saying that we were going to be attacking at Pas de Calais. And so that just kind of like further confirmed for the Germans of like, oh, they really are going to go to Pas de Calais, so we need to get out of Normandy. And so between the Ghost Army and Juan Pujol Garcia, they helped clear the way for us to be able to march in and conquer Paris. Our next group are the Monuments Men, and these men are really important because they were able to help protect our culture during the war. The war is going on, and there are all these bombs going off in really important places in Italy and in France, and it is threatening to destroy some of the world's most important and priceless works of art. And so the U.S. Army brought together these artists and architects and art historians and professors and so on and so forth, and they made their own battalion. And these men, their job was to go in and find and protect these priceless works of art, because this is what we're fighting for. This is the future that we're fighting for. If we lose this art, we're fighting for land. We're fighting for a political ideal, but we're not really fighting for anything. And so that's why these men were so important. It was also really important because of just how much stuff the Nazis had stolen. The Nazis had stolen over 5 million pieces of art. To put this into perspective, the Louvre, which is the largest art museum in the entire world, has only 70,000 pieces of art. And the Nazis stole art that was not just fine works of art like the Mona Lisa and the Pietà and all of these Renaissance works of art, but they also stole like paintings from people's homes that had been owned by, a painting of their grandmother. And most of these paintings had been stolen from the homes of Jews that had been thrown out of their homes during the period where we were sending them to the ghettos and sending them to the concentration camps. The Monuments Men were able to recover vast amounts of not only these works of art, but also gold bars and money and sculptures, etc. Some of these were found in the depths of these salt mines that were all throughout Poland and Germany. And so we were able to find these and recover them. And we also found some of them in some of the cathedrals that had been taken over by the Nazis. And you can see in this picture, this art that they discovered is like almost reaching the ceiling of this cathedral, that there were priceless statues that were just like out in the open because they didn't have anywhere where else to put them. And so we were able to get back a lot of these. Unfortunately, however, there are still millions of pieces of art that have not been recovered. And there are a couple of thoughts as to what happened here. It is likely that the Nazis, in their fear of of the war ending, basically took them and spread them to the four corners of the earth. Individual Nazis stole large amounts of art and would smuggle them away to different countries or to different places. So that's one of the things that could have happened. The other one that I feel much more unfortunate is that as they were, you know, getting to the point where they were likely going to be attacked and likely going to lose, the Nazis likely destroyed much of that art, setting it on fire and burning it. And so we do have large amounts of art that has never been recovered. This group of men is probably one of the more significant in helping us win the war in the Pacific, and these are the Navajo code talkers, sometimes referred to as the wind talkers. When the war began, the Germans had a great advantage because they had this code making and breaking machine called Enigma that was seemingly impossible for us to try and break. Also, we had the Japanese that had their own codes, and so we realized that codes were really the only way for us to protect our information. And so, because of this, we brought in a group of people that would be able to transmit codes that no one would be able to translate, and that was the Navajo. Why? Because Navajo is what we call a hidden language. Um, it is not a written down language. The only way to learn it is by living with the Navajo and being taught by a Navajo in order to learn the language. And so there are no Germans, there are no Japanese that know Navajo. And so this was going to make it easier for us to spread this information. Um, when the Navajo code talkers received a message, they were going to have these like seemingly unrelated Navajo words. So even if the enemy were able to learn some of the Navajo words, it still wouldn't make any sense to them because they would spell out or describe the military movements with these words. So, for example, using the word or the letter for A, they could use the Navajo word for ant or apple or axe. And all of those start with A, and so they could switch it up all the time. They could also use words to describe a whole thing. So, for example, the Navajo word for potato was used to describe grenades. The Navajo word for hummingbird was used to describe fighter pilots and fighter planes. So sometimes it was whole words, sometimes it was just letters, and it would rotate all the time. So it made it virtually impossible for the Axis to learn what we were doing. Unfortunately, however, this was information that was classified all the way up until the 1970s, and these men put their lives on the line and did so much to help us win the war in the Pacific, this incredibly difficult and deadly part of the war, and yet nobody knew they even existed until the 1970s, and that was because it was still so important for us to maintain this secrecy for our own protection. And so it's very good that today their contributions have finally been recognized. The next group that we have is the Tuskegee Airmen. Now, this was the very first African American military aviation group in the U.S. military, and they would train at the Tuskegee Institute, which was created by Booker T. Washington years before. Now, the U.S. military is segregated at this time, and anyone who is a person of color fighting in the U.S. military is going to face not only discrimination, but they are also going to generally be given less ideal jobs, and they are going to get less opportunities to actually fight in the war. And that's exactly what happens with the Tuskegee Airmen. They were seen as inferior, they were incapable of military greatness, and as a result, they were used as either bodyguards or even used to just like be couriers of information or cargo. And yet, when they served as bodyguards, they served valiantly. And in the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of missions that they flew protecting white pilots, they never lost a single one of those pilots, but they only lost 25 of their own lives in those escort missions. And it just shows just how incredibly talented they were, how well trained that they were. And yet, because of the color of their skin, they were denied the same
opportunities as well as denied the same recognition. However, one person that did recognize them was Eleanor Roosevelt. She went down to Tuskegee Institute to see kind of what the training was like and to talk to these enlisted men. And she says, well, that looks like a lot of fun. I would love to go up in a plane. And this, freaks out the or the Secret Service because, it's the First Lady going up in a plane. But it really concerns a lot of people because she's the First Lady and they're black. And yet, as you can see from this picture, she's just having the best time and is just loving every minute of this. And of course, wherever the First Lady goes, the media goes. And so they take this picture and it goes into the newspapers and into the magazines. And suddenly everybody across America is like, oh my gosh, the First Lady is flying with these black men. And it did help start this conversation about, are they really inferior or is it just our prejudice? And as you might guess, this infuriated FDR, but there's really not much that he could do because she had already gone on record as to how wonderful these men were and how talented they were and how patriotic they were and so on and so forth. So she did a lot to help bring up their profile. This is the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And if you notice anything about them, you will notice that they are all Japanese American. Like I said, all of our regiments are going to be segregated, that we are going to separate various races, and this is going to be one specifically for Japanese Americans. It's quite amazing that these men fought because many of their family members were actually already interned in the United States. Some of them had actually been interned, and as a way to show their patriotism and a way to show their loyalty to the United States, they signed up for service. And I think that that's absolutely fantastic and so honorable of them to stand up and fight for a country that didn't want you there. These men were part of the most highly decorated regiment in all of American military history. They actually have earned the nickname of the Purple Heart Battalion. And the reason for this is because of their participation in the attempt to save the lost battalion. There was a white regiment that had gotten themselves completely surrounded by the enemy. Several groups had gone in to try and rescue this battalion, and they suffered huge casualties and were unable to rescue this lost battalion. And there was going to be like one more attempt, and everybody knows this is a suicide mission. And yet the 442nd volunteered to do it. Why? Because it really went with their rallying cry and their motto, which was go for broke, which is basically the 1940s version of go big or go home. And so they went in and they did lose massive numbers of men. Lots and lots of them were wounded, hence the Purple Heart Battalion. But they were able to save the lost battalion and bring them back to safety. And so, yet again, this group of people who have been discriminated against by the United States, who have been mistreated so severely, are yet again showing and illustrating their immense patriotism and loyalty to this nation. Finally, we get to women in the military. We are going to have in World War II the very first official women's military units. While we did have some auxiliary groups in the previous wars, like World War I, where women were kind of helping with the war effort, these are like actual military units, the same as the Tuskegee Airmen or the 442nd, except for this one was segregating women away from the traditional men's groups. The reason that they brought women into the military is so that they could, quote unquote, release a man for combat. Essentially, they realized that there are jobs that women could do that did not require men, and thus those men could go and pick up a gun and actually fight the Nazis. These were generally non-combat support jobs. What does that mean? It's generally going to be a job where they are, working with inventory or working with cargo or working with maps or working with some kind of planning of troops, or things that essentially don't require you to pick up a gun. Anything where you're sitting at a desk, that was going to be what the women were doing. And the first of these organizations is going to be the Women's Army Corps. They were also known as the WACs. Their symbol was the one you see up in the corner there, and that is Athena, which is the goddess of war. Um, and the WACs were very highly regarded. In fact, General Douglas MacArthur said that the WACs were his best soldiers and said that they worked harder, complained less, and were better disciplined than the men. All in all, the women that joined in, over 150,000 women served in World War II, helping to release the equivalent of over 7 divisions of men for combat. You can see their importance. However, this is just for the Army. We also had it for the Navy. And those women would be known as WAVES, Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. They were given the same responsibilities, the same rank, and the same pay as the men. And that was very unique to the WAVES, that the women in the WACs were not treated the same and did not have the same rank or pay. They were different because of this separate unit. So that's definitely a step towards equality for these women. However, they were not allowed to actually serve on the ships. They served stateside. And the reason for that is because, as you can see from this picture, they were really afraid that if they were stuck on these boats for a long time, the boys would definitely get a little bit distracted. And so they wanted to make sure that that was not a problem. So the girls always ended up serving stateside. Finally, we are going to have the Air Force, and this is going to be the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, also known as the WASP. Now, the WASPs, similar to the Tuskegee Airmen, did not actually go into real life combat, that they were used to ferry planes, transport cargo, help, play war games that help with combat training. They were in charge of currying, being couriers for information and things like this, kind of these support jobs with the Air Force. This was something that was actually lobbied for by Eleanor Roosevelt. She felt that it was important that we had a role for women in the Air Force, just the same as these other groups. And women had already been flying planes for a long time. That women had been flying planes for their own entertainment, for kind of small commercial things, but also women had served flying planes for like crop dusting and things like that on farms. So we already had these women who had the ability and the training. We just needed to give them, an ability to do this for the military. And so women were allowed to join this group. However, it was for white women only. No African Americans were allowed into the WASP. As much as Eleanor Roosevelt tried to make it an integrated group, that was a place where FDR put his foot down and refused to allow black women to join the WASP. These women that have served have been denied traditional military burial, and specifically the WASP. The WASP did not get traditional military burial because they were technically not at the same level as the traditional Air Force, that they were seen as more of an auxiliary group, as kind of a support group, and so as a result of that, they were not allowed military burials until just recently, that they're, under President Obama, he actually passed a law that said, or made an executive order rather, that said that these women shall be allowed to have military burial in places like Arlington National Cemetery and be given the full 21-gun salute. So it's a nice way for us to remember their service, as well as the service of all the other women that were involved in the military during World War II. So that wraps up all of our different military groupings. You can kind of compare this to how these various groups contributed to the war effort on the home front, like we covered today. And if you have any questions, please let me know.